The Lost Apothecary by Sarah Pinner, told from the view of Nella and Eliza. Ancient Apothecary's Oath. I swear and promise before God, author and creators of all things, never to teach ungrateful persons or fools the secrets and mysteries of the trade, never to divulge the secrets confided to me, never to administer poisons, to disavow and shun as a pestilence the scandalous, the pernicious practice of quacks and pricks and alchemists, and to keep no stale or bad drug in my shop. May God continue to bless me so long as I continue to obey these things. Nella, February 3rd, 1791. She would come at daybreak, the woman whose letter I held in my hands, the woman whose name I did not yet know. I knew neither her age nor where she lived. I did not know her rank in society nor the dark things in which she dreamed when night fell. She could be a victim or a transgressor, a new wife or a vengeful widow, a nursemaid or a courtesan. But despite all that I did not know, I understood this. The woman knew exactly who she wanted dead. I lifted the blush-colored paper, illuminated by the dying flame of a single wick candle. I ran my finger over the ink of her words, imagining what despair brought this woman to seek out someone like me, not just an apothecary, but a murderer, a master of disguise. Her request was simple and straightforward. For my mistress's husband with his breakfast. Daybreak, February 4th. At once I drew to mind a middle-aged housemaid called to do the bidding of her mistress, and with an instinct perfected over the last 2 decades, I knew immediately the remedy most suited for this request: a chicken egg laced with nux vomica. The preparation would take mere minutes. The poison was within reach. But for a reason yet unknown to me, something about the letter left me unsettled. It was not the subtle, woodsy odor of the parchment, or the way the lower left corner curled forward slightly, as though once damp with tears. Instead, the disquiet brewed within inside me, the intuitive understanding that something must be avoided. But whatever unwritten warning could reside in a single sheet of parchment, shrouded beneath pen strokes, none at all, I assured myself. This letter was no omen. My troubling thoughts were merely the result of my fatigue. The hour was late, and the persistent discomfort in my joints. I drew my attention to the calfskin register on the table in front of me. My precious register was a record of life and death, an inventory of the many women who sought potions from here, the darkest of the apothecary shops. In the front pages of my register, the ink was soft, written with light hand, void of grief and resistance. These faded, worn entries belonged to my mother. This apothecary's shop for women's melodies, situated at 3 Back Alley, was hers long before it was mine. On occasion I would read her entries. March 23rd, 1767, Mrs. R. Ranford Yarrow, Milfoy 15 times 3, and the words evoked memories of her, the way her hair fell against the back of her neck as she ground the yarrow stem with the pestle, and the taut, papery skin of her hand as she plucked seeds from the flower's head. But my mother had not disguised her shop behind false walls, and she did not slip her remedies into vessels of dark red wine. She'd had no need to hide. The tinctures she dispensed were meant only for good, soothing the raw, tender parts of a new mother or bringing menses upon a barren wife. Thus she filled her register pages with the most benign of herbal remedies. They would raise no suspicion. On my register pages, I wrote things such as nettle and hyssop, and amaranth and yes, but also remedies more sinister, nightshade and hellebore and arsenic, Beneath the ink strokes of my register hid betrayal, anguish, and dark secrets. Secrets about the vigorous young man who suffered an alien heart on the eve of his wedding, or how it came to pass that a healthy new father fell victim to a sudden fever. My register laid it all bare. These were not weak hearts and fevers at all, but thorn apple juice and nightshade slipped into wine, and pies by cunning women whose names now stained my register. Oh, but only if the register told my own secrets, the truth about how it all began. For I had documented every victim in these pages, all but for one, Frederick. The black, sharp lines of his name defaced only my sullen heart, my sacred room. I gently closed the register, for I had no use of it tonight, and turned my attention to the letter. What worried me so? The edge of the parchment continued to catch my eye, as though something crawled beneath it. And the longer I remained at my table, the more my belly ached and my fingers trembled. In the distance beyond the walls of my shop, the bells on a carriage sounded frighteningly similar to the chains on the constable's belt. But I assured myself that the bailiffs would not come tonight, just as they had not come for the last 2 decades. My shop, like my poisons, was too cleverly disguised. No man would find this place. It was buried deep behind a cupboard wall at the base of a twisted alley in the darkest depths of London. I drew my eyes to the soot-stained wall. I had not the heart nor the strength to scrub clean. An empty bottle on the shelf caught my reflection. My eyes, once bright green like my mother's, now held little life within them. My cheeks, too, once flushed with vitality, were swollen and sunken. I had the appearance of a ghost, much older than my 41 years of age. Tenderly I began to rub around the bone in my left wrist, swollen with heat, like a stone left in the fire and forgotten. The discomfort in my joints had crawled through my body for years. It had grown so severe. I lived not a waking hour without pain. Every poison I dispensed brought a new wave of it upon me. Some evenings my fingers were so distended and stiff, I felt sure the skin would split open and expose what lay underneath. Killing and secret-keeping had done this to me. It had begun to rot me from the inside out, and something inside meant to tear me open. At once the air grew stagnant, and smoke began to crawl into the low stone ceiling of my hidden room. The candle was nearly spent, and soon the laudanum drops would wrap me in their heavy warmth. Night had long ago fallen, and she would arrive in just a few hours, the woman whose name I would add to my register, and whose mystery I would begin to unravel, no matter the unease it brewed inside of me. Nella, February 4th, 1791. When 3 Back Alley was a reputable women's apothecary shop belonging to my mother, it consisted of a single room, alight with flame and countless candles, and often teeming with customers and their babies. The little shop gave a sense of warmth and safety. In those days it seemed everyone in London knew of the shop for women's maladies, and the heavy oak door at the front of the shop rarely stayed shut for long. But many years ago, after my mother's death, after Frederick's betrayal, and after I began dispensing poisons to women across London, it became necessary to divide the spare room into 2 separate, distinct sections. This was easily accomplished with the installation of a wall of shelves, which split the room in 2. The first room, situated in the front, remained directly accessible to Back Alley. Anyone could open the front door, and it was nearly always unlocked. But most would assume they had arrived at the wrong destination. I now kept nothing in the room except an old grain barrel, and who had any interest in a bin of half-rotted pearly oats? Sometimes, if I was lucky, a nest of rats toiled away at one corner of the room. and this gave further impression of the disguise and neglect. This room was my first disguise. Indeed, many customers ceased coming. They had heard of my mother's death, and after seeing this room empty, they merely assumed that the shop had closed for good. The more curious, or nefarious sort, like young boys with sticky fingers, were not deterred by the emptiness. Seeking something to snatch, they pushed deeper into the room, inspecting the shelves for the wares or the books. But they would find nothing, because I left nothing to steal, nothing of interest at all. And so onward they would go, onward they always went. What fools they were! All of them, but the women who had been told where to look by their friends, their sisters, their mothers. Only they knew that the bin of pearly barley served as a very important function. It was the means of communication, a hidden place for letters, whose content dared not to be uttered aloud. Only they knew that the hiding place within the wall of the shelves invisible stood a door leading to my apothecary shop for women's maladies. Only they knew that I waited silently behind the wall, with my fingers stained with the residue of poison. It was where I now waited for the woman, my new patron, at daybreak. Hearing the slow creak of the storage room door, I knew she had arrived. Peering through the column of the shelving, aiming to get my first look, taken aback, I covered my mouth with trembling fingers. Was it a mistake? This was no woman at all. It was a mere girl, not more than 12 or 13, dressed in a gray woolen gown with threadbare navy cloak draped over her shoulders. She had come to the wrong place? Perhaps she was one of those little thieves who was not fooled by the storeroom, and she sought something to steal. If that was the case, she was better suited at a bakery shop, stealing cherry buns so she could fatten up a bit. But the girl, for her youth, arrived exactly at daybreak. She stood still, sure of herself in the storage room, her gaze directly at the false wall of shelving behind where I stood. No, this was no accidental visitor. At once I prepared to send her away on account of her age, but I stopped myself. In her note she had said she needed something for her mistress's husband. What might become of my legacy if this mistress was well known about town, and word got out that I sent a child away? Besides, as I continued to peek at the young girl through the cleft in the wall, she held high her head of thick black hair. Her eyes were round and bright, but she did not look down at her feet or back at the front door of the alley. She shivered silently, but I felt sure it was on account of the cool air rather than her nerves. The girl stood too tall, too proud, for me to make her fearful. With what did she brew her courage? The strict command of her mistress, or something more sinister? I maneuvered the latch out of its hold, swung the column of shelves inward, and motioned for the girl to come inside. Her eyes took in the tiny space in an instant, without need to even blink. The room was so small that if the girl and I stood together and spread our arms wide, we could nearly touch the opposite side of it. I followed her gaze across the shelves at the back of the wall, littered with glass vials and tin funnels, galley pots, grinder stones. On a second wall, as far as possible from the fire, my mother's oaken cupboard held an assortment of earthenware and porcelain jars meant for tinctures, herbs that fade and decayed in even the faintest of light. On the wall nearest the door stood a long, narrow counter, as tall as the girl's shoulder. On it rested a collection of metal scales, glass and stone weights, and a few bound reference guides on women's maladies. And if the girl were to pry inside the drawers beneath the counter, she would find spoons, corks, candlesticks, pewter plates, and a dozen sheets of parchment, many of them spoiled with hurried notes and calculations. Treading carefully around her and latching the door, my most immediate concern was providing my new customer with a sense of safety and discretion. My fears were unwarranted, for she plopped into one of my chairs as though she's been in my shop 100 times. I could see her better now that she sat in the light. Her figure was a slender one, and she had clear hazel eyes, almost too large for her oval face. Intertwining her fingers and setting her hands on the table, she looked at me and smiled. "Hello." "Hello," I replied, surprised by her manner. In an instant I felt a fool for having sensed any doom in this blush-colored letter written by a child. I wondered, too, about her beautiful penmanship, as such a young child. As my sense of worry diminished, it was replaced with a relaxed curiosity. I desired to know more of this girl. I turned to the hearth, which claimed one of the corners of the room. The pot of water that had set over the fire a short time ago spewed entrails of steam. "I've hot brewed some leaves," I said to the girl. I filled 2 mugs with the brew and set one in front of her. She thanked me, pulled her mug towards her. Her gaze came to settle on the table on which rested our mugs, a single-lit candle, my register, and the letter she'd left in the bin of pearly barley. "For my mistress's husband, with his breakfast. Daybreak, February 4th. The girl's cheeks, pink upon her arrival, remained flushed with youth. "What kind of leaves?" "Valerian," I told her, "spiced with cinnamon bark. A few sips to warm the body, a few more to brighten and relax the mind." We were quiet, then, for a minute or so, but it was not uncomfortable, not in the way that it can be between adults. I supposed the girl to be grateful, foremost, to be out of the cold. I gave her a few moments to warm herself, while I went to my counter and busied myself with a few black stones. They needed smoothing along the grounding board, after which they would make ideal vial stoppers. Unaware of the girl watching me, I lifted the first one, and pressing it down into my palm, rolled it, spun it around, rolled it again. 10 or 15 seconds were all I could manage before I had to stop and slow my breath. A year ago I was stronger, and my strength was so that I could roll and smooth these stones in a matter of minutes. But on this day, with the child watching me, I could not go on. My shoulders ached too badly. Oh, how I did not understand this ailment. Months ago it had been born in my elbow, and then shifted to the opposite wrist. And only very recently the heat had begun to slip into the joints of my fingers. The girl remained still, her fingers wrapped tightly around the mug. "What's that bowl of creamy stuff over there by the fire?" I turned away from the stones to look at the hearth. "A salve," I said, "of hog's lard and purple foxglove." "You're warming it, then? For it's too hard?" I paused at her quick understanding. "Yes, that's right." "What is the salve for?" Heat rose to my face. I could not tell her that the leaves of the purple foxglove, then dried and crushed, sucked the heat and the blood from the skin, and therefore assisted a great deal in the days after a woman had birthed a child, an experience unknown to girls the age of this one. "It is for a tear in the skin," I offered, taking a seat. "Oh, a poisonous salve for a tear in the skin?" Shaking my head, I said, "No, no poison in this child." Her little shoulders tensed. "But Mrs. Amwell, my mistress, told me you sell poison." "I do, but poison is not all I sell. The women who have been here for deadly remedies have also seen the extent of my shelves, and some have whispered of it to the most trusted friends. I dispense all sorts of oils and tinctures, anything an honorable apothecary might require in her shop. Indeed, when I began dispensing poisons many years ago, I did not simply clear my shelves of all but arsenic and opium. I continued to keep the ingredients needed to remedy most afflictions, supplies as benign as clary and tamarisk. Just because a woman has rid herself of one malady, a devious husband, for instance, does not mean she is immune to all other maladies. My register was proof of it. Interspersed among the deadly tonics were also many healing ones, And only girls come here? Said the child. Did your mistress tell you that too? Yes'm. Well, she was not mistaken. Only girls come here. With the exception of one long ago, no man has ever stepped foot in my shop of poisons. I only aided women. My mother held tight to this principle, instilling in me from an early age the importance of providing a safe haven, a place of healing for women. London grants little to women in need of tender care. Instead, it crawls with gentlemen's doctors, each as unprincipled and corrupt as the next. My mother committed to giving women a place of refuge, a place where they might be vulnerable and forthcoming about their ailments, without the lascivious appraisal of a man. The ideas of gentlemen's medicine did not align with my mother's either. She believed in the proven remedies of the sweet, fertile earth, not the schemes diagrammed in books studied by men with brandy on their tongues. The young girl in my shop looked around, the light of the flames in her eyes. How clever! I like this place, though it is a bit dark. How do you know when it is morning? There are no windows. I pointed to the clock on the wall. There is more than one way to tell the time, I said, and a window would do me no service at all. You must grow tired of the dark then. Some days I could not disguise night from day, as I had lost my intuitive sense of wakefulness long ago. My body seemed always in the state of fatigue. I'm accustomed to it, I said. How strange it was sitting across from this child. The last child to sit in this very room was me, decades ago, observing my own mother as she worked. But I was not this girl's mother, and her presence began to pull at me in an uncomfortable way. Though her naivety was enduring, she was very young. No matter what she thought of my shop, she could not need anything else I dispensed. The fertility aids, the cramp barks. She was here for only the poison, so I aimed to bring her back to the subject at hand. You have not touched your hot brew. She looked at it skeptically. I do not mean to be rude, but Mrs. Amwell told me to be very careful. I held up my hand to stop her. She was a smart girl. I took her mug into my own hands, drank deeply from it, and set it back down in front of her. At once she grabbed the mug and lifted it to her own lips, emptying the entire thing. I was parched, she said. Oh, thank you. How delicious. May I have more? I maneuvered myself out of the chair, taking 2 small steps to the hearth. I tried not to wince as I lifted the heavy pot to refill her mug. What is the matter with your hand? She asked from behind me. What do you mean? You've been holding it funny this whole time, as though it hurts. Did you injure it? No, I said. It's rude to pry. But I regretted my tone with her instantly. She was merely inquisitive, just as I was once. How old are you? I asked her in a softer tone. 12. I nodded, having expected something thereabouts. Quite young. She hesitated, and by the rhythmic movement of her skirts, I presumed she was tapping her foot on the floor. She paused. I have never killed anyone. I nearly laughed. You're only a child. I wouldn't expect you to have killed many people in your short life. My eyes fell on a shelf behind her, where there rested a small porcelain dish the color of milk. Inside the dish lay 4 brown hen's eggs, poison disguised within. And what is your name? Eliza. Eliza Fanning. Eliza Fanning, I repeated. Age 12. Yes, miss. And your mistress sent you here today? Is that right? The arrangement told me that Eliza's mistress must trust her greatly, but the child paused and furrowed her brow, and what she said next surprised me. It was her idea initially, yes, but I was the one to suggest the breakfast table. My master fancies supper with his friends, and sometimes is gone for a full night or 2. I thought breakfast might be the best idea. I looked to Eliza's letter on the table and ran my thumb across one edge. Given her youth, I felt it necessary to remind her of something. and you understand that this will not just harm him, this will not just make him ill, but, I slowed my words, this will kill him as surely as it will kill any animal. That is what you and your mistress intend, yes? Little Eliza looked up at me, her eyes sharp. She folded her hands neatly in front of her. Yes, miss. As she said it, she did not so much as flinch. Nella, February 4th, 1791. I walked to the shelf behind Eliza and retrieved the small, milk-colored dish, resting inside with the 4 brown hen eggs, 2 of them slightly larger than the others. I set the dish of eggs onto the table, leaning forward, as though badly wanting to reach for the dish. Eliza set her hands on the table, her palms leaving a damp residue. In truth, I saw much of my own childhood in her, the wide-eyed curiosity about something novel, something that most other children don't get to experience, though that part of me felt 1,000 years dead. The difference was that I had first seen the contents of this shop, the vials and the scales, stone weights, at a much younger age than 12. My mother introduced them to me as soon as I was able to lift and sort objects, to distinguish one from another, to order and rearrange. When I was only 6 or 7, my attention span was fleeting. My mother taught me simple, easy things like colors. The vials of blue and black oil must stay on this shelf, the red and yellow on that shelf. As I entered adolescence, I became more skilled, more discerning. The task grew in difficulty. She might, for instance, dump an entire jar of hops onto the table, spread out the dry, bitter cones, and ask me to rearrange them according to complexion. As I worked, my mother would toil beside me with her tinctures and brews, explaining to me the difference between scruples and drachms, gallipots and cauldrons. These were my playthings, whereas other children amused themselves with blocks and sticks and cards in the muddy alleyways. I spent my entire childhood in this very room. I came to know the color, consistency, and flavor of hundreds of ingredients. I studied the great herbalist and memorized the Latin names within the pharmacopoeia. Indeed, there existed little doubt that someday I would preserve my mother's shop and carry on her legacy of goodwill to women. I never intended to stain that legacy, to leave it twisted and tarnished. Eggs, Eliza whispered, jolting me from my reverie. She looked up at me, confused. You have a chicken that lays poisonous eggs? Despite the seriousness of my meeting with Eliza, I could not help but laugh. It was a perfectly logical thing for a child to say, and I leaned back in my chair. No, not quite. I lifted one of the eggs, showed it to her, and returned it to the dish. You see here, if we look at these 4 eggs together, can you tell me which 2 are the largest? Eliza furrowed her brow and bent down until the table was level with her eyes and studied the eggs for several seconds. Then abruptly she sat up, a proud look on her face, and pointed. These 2, she declared. Good, I nodded. The larger 2. You must remember that. The larger 2. They are the poisonous ones. The large ones, she repeated. She took a sip of her tea. But how? I put 3 of the eggs back in the dish, but I kept one of the larger ones out. I turned it in my hand so that my palm cupped the fat base of the egg. What you can't see, Eliza, is a tiny hole here at the top of the egg. It is covered now with matching wax, but if you'd seen it here yesterday, you would have seen a tiny black dot where I inserted the poison with a needle. It did not break? She exclaimed, as though I had demonstrated some magic trick. And I cannot even see the wax. Precisely, and yet there is poison inside, enough to kill somebody. Eliza nodded, gazing at the egg. What kind of poison is it? Nux vomica, rat poison. An egg is the ideal place for the crushed seeds, as the yolk, viscous and cool, preserves it, no different than as if there was a baby chicken inside. I returned the egg to the dish with the others. You'll be using the egg soon? Tomorrow morning, Eliza said. When he is home, my mistress and her husband will eat together. She paused as though imagining the breakfast table laid out before her. I will give my mistress the 2 smaller eggs. And how will you tell them apart after you have dumped them into a pan? This stumped her, but only briefly. I will cook the smaller eggs first, and then set them on the plate meant for my mistress, and then cook the larger eggs. Very good, I said. It will not take long. Within seconds. He may complain of a burning sensation in his mouth. Be sure to serve the eggs as hot as you can, so he does not know any better. Perhaps underneath a gravy or pepper sauce. He will think he's only burning his tongue with the heat. Soon after, he will feel nauseous, and he will most certainly want to lie down. I leaned forward, making sure Eliza clearly understood what I was to say next. I suggest you do not permit yourself to see him after this. Because he will be dead, you mean? She said, expressionless. Not immediately, I explained. In the hours after ingesting nux vomica, most victims suffer a rigid spine. They may arch their back, like their body has been strung into a bow. I have never seen it myself, but I have been told it's horrifying, indeed the cause of a lifetime of nightmares. I leaned back into my chair, softening my gaze. When he dies, of course, this rigidity will release. He will look much more peaceful then. And later, if someone asks to inspect the kitchen or the pans, they will find nothing, I assured her. Because of the magic? Placing my hands in my lap, I shook my head. Little Eliza, let me make sure you are very clear. This is not magic. There are not spells and incantations. These are earthly things, as real as the smudge of dirt on your cheek. I licked the pad of my thumb, bent forward, and ran it across her cheek. Satisfied, I sat back in my chair. Magic and disguise may achieve the same end, but I assure you, they are very different things. A look of confusion crossed her face. Do you know the meaning of disguise? I added. She shook her head, shrugged one shoulder. I motioned to the hidden door through which Eliza had come. When you came into the storage room this morning, on the other side of where we sit now, do you know that I watched you from a tiny hole set into the wall? I pointed to the entrance of my hidden room. No, she said. I had no idea you were back here. When I first came in, I found it empty. I thought you would come in off the alley behind me. I would very much like one of these hidden rooms in a house some day. I tilted my head towards her. Well, if you have something to hide, you very well might need to build yourself a hidden room. It has been here always? No, when I was a child and worked here with my mother, there was no need for a room like this. We did not have poisons back then. The girl frowned. You have not always sold poisons? Not always, no. Though there was little sense in sharing the details with this young Eliza. The admission unfurled a painful memory. 20 years ago, my mother developed a cough at the start of the week, a fever by midweek, and was dead by Sunday. Gone in a short span of 6 days. At the age of 21, I had lost my only family, my only friend, my great teacher. My mother's work had become my work, and our tinctures were all I knew about the world. I wished at the time that I had died with her. I could hardly keep the shop afloat. Such was the sea of grief pulling me under. I could not call on my father, having never known him. Decades ago, as a boatman, he lived in London several months, just long enough to seduce my mother before his crew set sail again. I had no siblings, few friends to speak of. The life of an apothecary is a strange one, and a solitary one. The very nature of my mother's business meant we spend most of the time in the companionship of potions and people. After she left me, I believed my heart had been fractured, and I feared my mother's legacy and the shop would also meet their demise. But like an elixir splashed onto the very flame of my grief, a young, dark-haired man named Frederick entered my life. At the time, though, I had thought the chance encounter was a blessing. His presence began to soothe and cool so much that had gone awry. He was a meat merchant, making quick work of the mess I'd accumulated since my mother's death. Debt I had not paid, dues I had not collected, and even after the shop's figure had been fixed, Frederick remained. He did not want to be apart from me, nor I from him. Whereas I'd once thought myself skilled in only the things of my apothecary shop, I soon realized my expertise in other techniques. The release between the two bodies, a remedy that couldn't be found in the vials lining my walls. In the weeks to follow, we fell terribly, wonderfully in love. My sea of grief grew shallower. I could breathe again, and I could envision the future, a future with Frederick. I couldn't have known that mere months after falling in love with him, I would dispense a fatal dose of rat poison to kill him. The first betrayal, the first victim, the beginning of a stained legacy. The shop must not have been very amusing back then, Eliza said, turning her head away as though she was disappointed. No poisons, no hidden room? Anyone would like a secret room. Though her innocence was inviolable, she was too young to understand the curse of a once loved place, hidden room or not, that had been marred by loss. It is not about amusement, Eliza. It is about concealment. That is what it means to disguise something. Anyone can buy poisons, but you cannot simply drop a pellet of it into one's scrambled eggs, because the officials may find residue, or the box of poison in the trash. No, it must be so cleverly disguised that it is untraceable. The poison is disguised in that egg, just as my shop is disguised in the bowels of an old storage room. That way, anyone not meant to be here will undoubtedly turn around and leave. The storage room at the front is a measure of protection for me, you might say. Eliza nodded, her bun nodding at the base of her neck. She would soon be a beautiful young woman, more handsome than most, her long eyelashes and the sharp angles of her face. She hugged the dish of the eggs to her chest. I suppose this is all I need, then. She pulled several coins from her pocket and then set them on the table. I counted them quickly. 4 shillings, 6 pence. She stood, then touched her lips with her fingertips. But how shall I transport them? I fear they may break inside the pocket of my gown. I had sold poisons to women 3 times her age, who thought nothing of the vials snapping inside their pockets. Eliza, it seemed, was wiser than all of them put together. I handed her a reddish glass jar. Together, we carefully placed each egg in the jar, then covered it with a centimeter of wood ash before placing the egg on top. You must still handle it carefully, I warned. And I placed a hand softly over hers. 1 egg will do the trick, if it must. Her look darkened, and in the moment I sensed that despite the youthfulness and buoyancy she had demonstrated thus far, she did indeed understand the gravity of what she must do. Thank you, Miss, Nella, I said. Nella Clevenger. And what is his name? Thomas Amwell, she said confidently, of Warwick Lane, near the cathedral. She lifted up the jar to ensure the eggs were properly nestled within inside. But then she frowned. "A bear," she observed, gazing at the small image etched on the jar. My mother had decided upon the bear etching long ago, as there were countless back alleys in London, but only ours ran next to Bear Alley. The little etching on the jar was harmless enough, and recognized only by those who needed to know. "Yes," I urged, "so you do not mix up the jar with another one." Eliza stepped to the door. With a steady hand, she ran a single finger down the side of one of the blackened stones near the entrance. It left a sharp line in the soot, revealing a finger-width band of the unblemished stone. She smiled, amused, as if she'd just drawn me a picture on a spare sheet of paper. "Thank you, Miss Nella. I must say that I loved your tea, and I love this hidden shop, and I very much hope we meet again." I raised my eyebrow. Most of my customers were not killers by trade, and, unless she returned needing a medical remedy, I did not expect to see her again. But I merely smiled at the inquisitive girl. "Yes," I said, "perhaps we will meet again." I unlatched the door and swung it in and watched as Eliza exited through the storage room and out into the alley, her small frame melting into the shadows outside. Once she had gone, I spent a few minutes thinking about the girl's visit. She was a strange young thing. I had no doubt she would accomplish her task, and I was grateful for the monetary gaiety she brought into the otherwise cheerless shop of poisons. I was glad I had not refused her, glad I had not heeded the ominous feeling first brought on by the letter. Taking my seat once again at the table, I pulled my register close. I turned to the back, locating the next empty space, and prepared to write my entry. Then, dipping the nib into the well of ink, I put it to the paper and wrote, "Thomas Amwell, Egg Prep, N.V., February 4th, 1791, on account of Ms. Eliza Fanning, age 12. Eliza, February 5th, 1791. I woke to a pain in my belly, unlike any I had felt before. I placed my hands underneath my night shift and pressed my fingers into my skin. Beneath them, my skin felt warm and swollen, and I clenched my teeth as a dull ache began to spread itself. It was not the same belly ache I might have after too many sweets or spinning around in the summer garden with the fireflies back home. This ache was lower, like I needed to relieve myself. I rushed over to the chamber pot, but the heaviness still wouldn't go away. Oh, but what an important task lay ahead of me, the most important one my mistress has ever given me. I could not disappoint her by saying I did not feel well, and I would like to stay in bed. Those excuses might have worked on the farm with my parents on a day when the horses needed brushing, or the beans were ready to be plucked from their stalks. But not today, not in the towering brick house belonging to the Amwells. Wiggling out of my night shift and walking to the wash basin, I resolved to ignore the discomfort. As I washed, as I tidied my garret room, and I stroked the nameless fat tabby cat who slept at the end of my cot, I whispered quietly to myself, as though saying it aloud made it more believable. This morning I will give him the poisonous eggs. The eggs, they remain nestled in the jar of ash, tucked into the pocket of my gown hanging near the bed. I removed the jar and pulled it close to my chest. The coolness of the glass even reached me through my nightgown. As I clutched the jar more tightly, my hands did not shake, not one bit. I was a brave girl, at least about some things. 2 years ago, at the age of 10, I rode with my mother from our small village of Swindon to the great sprawling city of London. I had never been to London and had only heard rumors of its filth and its wealth. An inhospitable place for people like us, my father, a farmer, had always muttered. But my mother disagreed. Privately, she would tell me of London's bright colors, the golden steeple of the churches, the peacock blues of the gowns, and of the many particular shops and stores in the city. She had described exotic animals wearing waistcoats, their handlers ushering them through the city streets, and market stands selling hot almond cherry buns to a line of customers 3 dozen deep. For a girl like me, surrounded by livestock and wild shrubs bearing little more than bitter fruit, such a place was unthinkable. With 4 other brothers to help on the farm, my mother had insisted on finding me a placement for me in London once I reached the proper age. She knew if I did not leave the countryside at a tender age, I would never see a life outside the pastures and the pig pens. My parents had argued about it for months. My mother would not relent, not even a bit. The morning of my departure, I was tearful. It was a tense one. My father hated to lose 2 good hands on the farm. My mother hated the separation from her youngest child. I feel as though I'm slicing off a piece of my heart, she sobbed, smoothing out the lap quilt she had just placed in my case. But I will not let it doom you to a life like mine. Our destination was the servants' registry office. As we rode into town, my mother leaned close, the sadness in her voice now replaced with exhilaration. "You must begin where life has slotted you," she said, gripping my knee, "and move upward from there. There is nothing wrong with starting as a scullery maid or a housemaid. Besides, London is a magical place." "What do you mean by magical, Mother?" I asked, my eyes wide as the city began to come into view. The day was clear and blue. Already, I imagine, calluses on my hands growing smaller. "I mean that you will be anything you want in London," she replied. "Nothing great awaits you in the farm fields. The fences would keep you in, as they do the pigs, and as they've done to me. But in London, well, in time, if you are clever about it, you can wield your own power like a magician. In a city so grand, even a poor girl can transform into whatever she desires to be." "Like an indigo butterfly," I said, thinking of the glassy cocoon I'd seen in the moorland during the summer. In a matter of days, the cocoons would turn black as soot, as if the animal inside had shriveled up to die. But then the darkness would lift, revealing the butterfly striking blue wings within the papery encasement. Soon after the wings would pierce the cocoon, and the butterfly would take flight. "Yes, like a butterfly," Mom agreed. "Even powerful men cannot explain what happens inside a cocoon. It is magic, surely, just like that which happens inside London." From that moment forward, I desired to know more of this thing called magic, and I could hardly wait to explore the city in which we'd just arrived. At the servants' registry office, my mother stood patiently aside while a pair of women looked over me. One of them was Mrs. Amwell in a pink satin gown and a cap brooched with lace. I could hardly keep from staring. I had never seen in all my life such a pink satin gown. Mrs. Amwell seemed to take an instant liking to me. She bent forward to speak to me, crouching low so our faces almost touched, and soon after she placed her arm around my mother, whose eyes were brimming again with tears. I was delighted when Mrs. Amwell finally took my hand in hers. She walked me to the broad mahogany desk at the front of the office and asked the attendant for the papers. As she filled in the required information, I noticed that Mrs. Amwell's hand shook badly as she wrote, and it seemed a great effort to keep the nib of the pen steady. Her words were jagged and bent at odd angles, but it meant little to me. I had been unable to read in those days, and all handwriting looked as illegible as the next. After a tearful goodbye with my mother, my new mistress and I took a coach to the house she shared with Mr. Amwell, her husband. I was to work first in the scullery, And so Mrs. Amwell introduced me to Sally, the cook, and the kitchen aide. In the weeks to follow, Sally minced no words. According to her, I did not know the proper way to scour a pot or how to pick roots from a potato without damaging its flesh. As she showed me the right way of doing things, I put up no complaint, for I enjoyed my placement with the Amwells. I had my own room in the attic, which was more than my mother had told me to expect. And from there I could watch the amusing, ever-present activity on the street below, the sedan chairs rushing past, the porters bearing enormous boxes of unseen goods, the comings and goings of a young couple who I believed newly in love. Eventually, Sally grew comfortable with my abilities and began allowing me to assist in the preparation of meals. It felt a small movement upwards, just as my mother had said, and it gave me hope. Someday, I, too, hoped to be toiling about in the magnificent streets of London in pursuit of something greater than potatoes and pots. One morning, while I was carefully arranging dried herbs on a platter, a housemaid rushed downstairs. Mrs. Amwell wanted to see me in her drawing room. Terror struck me at once. I felt sure I had done something wrong, and I ascended the stairs slowly, held back by the sense of dread. I had been at the Amwells' house not even 2 months. My mother would be horrified if I was dismissed in such a short time. But when I stepped into the mistress's pale blue drawing room, she closed the door behind me. She merely smiled and asked me to sit down next to her at her writing desk. Here she opened a book and produced a blank sheet of paper, a pen, and an inkwell. She pointed at several words in a book and asked me to write them down. I was not comfortable holding a pen, not at all, but I pulled the pages close and steadily copied the words as best as I could. Mrs. Amwell watched me closely as I worked, her brow knitted together, her chin in her hand. When I finished the first few words, she selected several more, and almost immediately I noticed an improvement in my own pen strokes. My mistress must have noticed it too, for she nodded approvingly. Next, she pushed aside the sheet of paper and lifted the book. She asked if I understood any of the words, and I shook my head. She then pointed to several of the short words, she, cart, plum, and explained how each letter made its own sound, and how words strung together on paper could convey an idea, a story. Like magic, I thought. It was everywhere, if only one knew to look. That afternoon in the drawing room was our first lesson, our first of countless lessons, sometimes twice a day. For my mistress's condition, which I'd first noticed at the registry office, had worsened. The tremor in her hand had grown so severe she could no longer write her own correspondence, and she needed me to do it for her. In time, I worked in the kitchen less and less, and Mrs. Amwell called for me often to her drawing room. This was not well received by the other household staff, Sally most of all. But I didn't worry myself over it. Mrs. Amwell was my mistress, not Sally, and I could not refuse the cake balls, the ribbons, and the penmanship lessons by the drawing-room hearth, now could I? It took me many months to learn to read and write, and even longer to learn how to speak like a child who had not come from the country. But Mrs. Amwell was a wonderful tutor, gentle and soft-spoken, wrapping my hands in hers to form the letters, laughing with me when the pen slipped. Any lingering thoughts of home vanished. It shamed me to admit it, but I did not want to see the farm, not ever again. I wanted to remain in London, in the grandeur of my mistress's drawing room, for those long afternoons at her writing desk when I was burdened only by the gaze of the jealous servants were some of my best memories. Then something changed a year ago, when the roundness of my face began to fall away, and the edge of my bodice grew tight. I could ignore it no longer. The feeling of another gaze, a new one, and the sensation that someone watched me too closely. It was Mr. Amwell, my mistress's husband. He had, for reasons I could only faintly understand, begun to pay more attention to me, and I felt sure my mistress sensed it too. It was almost time. My belly ache was not so bad anymore. Moving about the kitchen seemed to help. I was grateful for it, for following Nella's instructions would require me to be careful and steady. A slip of my hand, which might be laughed about in my mistress's drawing room, would be very bad today. The 2 smaller eggs sizzled in the pan. The fat spit onto my apron, while the white edges of the egg bubbled and curled. I remained still, concentrating, and spooned the egg from the pan when the edges reached the color of honey, just as the mistress liked. I placed her eggs on a plate, covered them with a cloth, and set them aside. I then spent a few minutes tending to the gravy which Nella suggested. As the gravy thickened, I realized it was the final moment to undo what I had not yet done, to strip out the thread which had not yet been sewn in. If I followed through, I would be like one of those men at Tyburn that I've heard about at the hanging day fairs, a criminal. Goose flesh scurried across my skin as I thought of it. As I considered briefly the idea of lying to my mistress, telling her that the poisoned egg must have been too weak, I shook my head. Such a lie would be cowardly, and Mr. Amwell would remain alive. The plan which Mrs. Amwell set into motion would fail because of me. I wasn't meant to be in the kitchen at all today. Last week, Sally had asked Mrs. Amwell for a few days away to visit her ailing mother. My mistress had readily approved, and afterwards called me to her drawing room for another lesson. But this lesson was not about penmanship or letter writing. It was one about the hidden apothecary shop. She told me I was to leave a note in the bin of pearly barley just inside the door of 3 Back Alley, and that the note should specify the date and the time I meant to return for the remedy, which was, of course, a deadly one. I did not ask my mistress why she meant to harm her husband. I suspected it was because of what happened a month ago, just after the New Year, when my mistress left the house and spent the day at the Winter Gardens near Lambeth. That day, Mrs. Amwell had asked me to organize a pile of letters, giving me several dozen to sort through before leaving for the gardens, but I could not complete my task because of the headache. Mid-morning, Mr. Amwell stumbled upon me with tears on my cheeks. The pressure behind my eyes had become most unbearable. He insisted that I retire to my room and sleep. A few minutes later, he offered me a drink that he said would help, and I sucked down a very sharp honey-colored liquid as quickly as I could, even though it made me cough and gasp. It looked like the brandy my mistress sometimes sipped from the bottle, though I could not fathom why anyone would willingly drink such a thing. I slept away the headache in the quiet, sunny comfort of my room. Eventually I woke to the smell of animal fat, a tallow candle, and my mistress's cool touch on my forehead. The ache in my head had gone. Mrs. Amwell asked me how long I had been asleep, and I told her truthfully that I did not know, and that I had laid down mid-morning. "It is now 10:30 at night," she told me, meaning I had slept for nearly 12 hours. Mrs. Amwell had asked me if I had any dreams. Although I shook my head, the truth was that faint memory had begun to form. One I felt sure was a dream I had only had a few hours ago. It was a memory of Mr. Amwell in my garret room. He had lifted the fat tabby cat from her place on my cot and set her into the corridor, then closed the door and approached me. He took a seat next to me, placing his hand on my stomach, and we began to talk. Try as I might, I could not remember what we discussed in the dream. He then began to move his hand upward, slightly along my navel. Then one of the footmen made a commotion downstairs. A pair of gentlemen had arrived, needing to speak urgent to Mr. Amwell. I admitted the story to my mistress, but I said that I did not know whether it had happened in a dream or real. Afterwards she remained at my side, a concerned look on her face. She pointed to the empty brandy glass and asked if Mr. Amwell had given it to me. I told her yes. She then leaned in close and placed one of her hands on mine. "Is it the first time he has done so?" I nodded. "And you are well now? Nothing hurts?" I shook my head. Nothing hurt. My mistress eyed the glass carefully, tucked the blankets in close around me, and wished me a good night. It was only after she had done that I heard the soft cry of the tabby cat outside my room. She was in the corridor, mewing to be let inside. Now I handled each of the larger eggs like they were made of glass. It was a tricky thing, to be sure, and I had never given so much thought to the pressure of which I should crack an egg. The pan was still very hot, and the yolks began to cook most instantly. I feared to stand too close, lest I breathe any poisonous odors, so I tended the eggs with a long, outstretched arm, and soon my shoulders ached like it did when I used to climb trees in the country. Once cooked, I removed the 2 larger eggs to a second plate. I smothered them in gravy and threw the 4 eggshells into the rubbish bin, straightened my apron, and, being very sure to place the poisonous eggs on the right side of the tray, I left the kitchen. The master and missus were already seated, engaged in a quiet discussion about an upcoming banquet. "Mr. Basford said there will be a display of sculptures," Mrs. Amwell said, "procured from all over the world." Mr. Amwell grunted in response, looking up at me as I entered the dining room. "Ah," he says, "here we are." My mistress rubbed her collarbone. Where her fingers touched, the skin was red and splotchy. She seemed jittery, even though I carried the tray of poisonous eggs. This annoyed me somewhat. She had been too scared to retrieve the eggs herself, and now she seemed unable to calm her nerves. He said to her, his eyes never leaving me. "Bring that over here, quickly now, girl." Stepping close to him from behind, I lifted his tray from the right side of the tray and carefully set it in front of him. As I did so, he reached his hand behind my leg and pulled the heavy fabric of my skirt upward. He ran his hand over the back of my knee and upward to my lower thigh. "Lovely," he said, finally pulling his hand away and lifting his fork. My leg itched where he had touched it, an invisible rash beneath my skin. I stepped away from him and set the second plate in front of the mistress. She nodded at me, her collarbone still flushed. Her eyes were sad and dark, and dim as the maroon rosettes on the paper wall behind her. I took my place at the edge of the dining room and waited, still as stone, for what would come next. What will come next? Will Mr. Amwell eat the poisonous eggs? Will he get what he deserved? We'll find out in Part 2 of The Lost Apothecary, told from the view of Nella and Eliza.